Good evening and welcome to the October 11, 2018 regular meeting of the Brisbane Planning Commission. Could we please have a roll call?
Yes, Commissioner Gomez. Here. Commissioner Ciesan.
Here.
And Chair Mackin.
Here.
And we'll know for the record that Commissioner Gooding and Patel are absent.
Thank you. Could we please have a motion for adoption of the agenda?
I make a motion to adopt today's agenda.
And I second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Hearing none opposed, the agenda remains as is. Consent calendar, we have nothing tonight. Oral communications, I see no one wishing to speak. Written communications, we have one item. It's the Bay Area Monitor. It's the publication from the League of Women Voters of the Bay Area. This evening we have a workshop. We have two, actually. The first item is inclusionary zoning and density bonus ordinance. I'll just mention the second one is regarding parking ordinance. So we'd like to start with the first. Staff report, please.
Okay, good evening, Commission. So tonight we'll start off with a workshop on our inclusionary housing and density bonus ordinance. We're just going to go over the underlying state regulations, then our own local regulations, and then some topics for our upcoming update. So just some background, California first saw inclusionary housing laws in the 1970s, so almost 40 years. For a long time, that resulted in the production of almost 100,000 permanently affordable units or deed-restricted units. In 2009, a California Supreme Court case decision prohibited local jurisdictions from applying these requirements to rental developments because of a conflict that they saw with another state law. However, in 2017, just last year, Governor Brown signed a bill that reaffirmed the authority of cities to apply inclusionary requirements to rental housing developments. So, inclusionary housing regulations, they come from the government code. Basically, the idea is that it would allow for housing affordable to households that earn less than the area median income, 120% of the area median income, which we would call moderate income households. Would be required to be incorporated into a market rate housing development. And we would ensure the affordability of those units through deed restrictions or rental agreements, depending if they were for sale or to be rented. Cities aren't required to adopt inclusionary housing ordinances, but we have the authority to do so under state law. And then going over to density bonus, that's also the authority to provide for that is from the California Government Code. And it essentially says that a developer may get additional density for projects that for residential projects of 5 or more units or lots, so it could be a subdivision as well, or mixed-use projects that involve residential, as long as they provide on-site affordable housing or dedicate land for affordable housing development, provide childcare facilities, or provide senior or special needs group housing. There are several categories there that would trigger the density bonus. So we'll dive a little bit more into the density bonus regulations here. The percentage of the bonus, which is again a percentage of the base density. So if your base density is 20 dwelling units per acre, that's what the bonus would be calculated on. The maximum bonus that can be sought is 35% over the base density. There are a suite of, in addition to the actual density bonus, there are other incentives, concessions, or waivers that developers can also request to make the development of the affordable housing either less costly or to allow for the physical building envelope to accommodate the density bonus. So an incentive or a concession, those are actually limited. They can request no more than 3. And those are specifically requests that would allow for the development, that would reduce the cost of development, basically. The waivers of development standards are really geared towards mitigating the physical limitations. So say we have a height limit of 35 feet, but they ask for a density bonus. That means that they actually need a 40-foot building. They would request a waiver of a development standard there to the height. So incentives, concessions, they're to reduce costs. Waivers of development standards, those are to get around physical limitations. There's also a third category of parking reductions. Those are just kind of something that apply. The developer would invoke them, and they're basically reduced parking standards that in some cases are much less than what a city might require otherwise. So for local jurisdictions, we are required to adopt an ordinance that basically explains how we'll implement the state law. Even if a city doesn't have an ordinance, that doesn't mean the density bonus requirements still apply. So the ordinance really is supposed to discuss how we'll implement the state law that governs. So this would be establishing a procedure. How do we process and administer their incentive and concession requests? How we may ensure for the affordability restrictions to be recorded with the housing, that sort of thing. Okay, so when we're talking about inclusionary housing, which is where, again, we have a market rate development that's a certain size, certain number of units in that development have to be affordable. Inclusionary units will count as affordable units for a density bonus. So we've provided here kind of a example that kind of bears that out. So if a developer applies to build a 15-unit multifamily project, which is the maximum number allowed by the zoning, and we require through our inclusionary that 2 of those 15 units be affordable to low-income households, then that would trigger, or the developer, by providing those inclusionary units, would already be eligible then for a density bonus under state law. So our inclusionary ordinance, it's not an additive provision of units when we're looking at the density bonus applicability. Okay, so the city's existing laws for both inclusionary housing and density bonus ordinance implementation, they're combined together into 17.31. So the inclusionary requirements apply to residential projects that consist of 6 or more units or lots. The number of inclusionary units is really a range, so it's based on the, I'll kind of illustrate a little bit more. Given on a range of units, there's kind of a set number of affordable units that have to be provided. So it can go anywhere from 10 to 20% of the total project size. Our inclusionary ordinance also establishes incentives, which the word incentive is a little interesting. It's a requirement that developers provide the inclusionary housing units. So the incentives really are kind of exceptions that we're allowing. So if when you provide the inclusionary units, not if, but when, you may also then be eligible for example, using slightly different materials for the affordable housing units, other provisions that could help the developer reduce some of the costs associated with those affordable unit production. That's what we call incentives in our current ordinance. Our current ordinance also requires that all affordable units be built on site. There's no in lieu fee. There is no provision for building them somewhere else. Other cities, larger cities usually have a lot more options for a developer to provide those affordable housing units. But for us, we require they actually be built in the development. And then moving on to our density bonus requirements. The density bonus, it applies to, again, residential projects of 5 or more units or lots. And it essentially, our ordinance reproduces the requirements of state law at the time our ordinance was adopted, which was almost 10 years ago now. So it kind of reproduces those requirements. It also establishes guidelines for how we're going to grant the incentives, concessions, and waivers. And then we have combined requirements for both density bonus and inclusionary projects that basically outline how, again, like an affordable housing plan would identify the bonuses that have been requested, the incentives, waivers, and their justification, and where the affordable units will be provided. Kind of skip over this part. Okay, so the meat of what we're going to focus on tonight. We are obligated to update our ordinance. It's not only 10 years old, but our housing element has specifically said that we will. So I think the time is right, and we are obligated to do so. In thinking about the topics for our update, the most significant one for us is a law that was passed last year, AB 1505, which we provided attached to your staff memo in the packet. And this basically says that if an ordinance that applies to rental housing, that applies inclusionary requirements to rental housing, requires that if the number of inclusionary units are required is more than 15%, we have to provide an economic study to basically justify that higher percentage and show that it is not discouraging the development of affordable housing. So the state's aim there is really to make sure that we have inclusionary requirements that allow for the development of affordable housing. They're not so burdensome that they actually are discouraging all development altogether. So because our ordinance does have this kind of range of inclusionary housing requirements depending on what the size of your development is, that's one area that staff's going to be looking at, whether we should just revise the inclusionary requirements for rental at least, and probably should be consistent with for sale to be just a flat percentage of the total units. That's one thing we'll be studying. That law also requires that we have at least one alternative to building the inclusionary units on site. So one of the more common alternatives would be an in lieu fee. So basically saying, if you don't want to build the units on site, you'll pay a fee for every unit that you're not building. That would then go to our affordable housing fund to help fund affordable housing projects. There's other options in that as well. Land dedication has its pros and cons. One of the cons being we don't have a lot of available land that's very easy to develop. So there's a couple different options there that we could think about. Another update topic. So as I said, our ordinance kind of parrots the state regulations because local ordinances really are supposed to describe how we're going to implement the density bonus, what procedures, how we're going to administer it. And considering how often density bonus law is updated at the state level, it seems logical that we might want to take out the kind of direct language that copies whatever state law said in 2009 and instead just incorporate references to the statutes. So that way our ordinance stays as up to date as possible. And we just need to update our administrative procedures, which hopefully we won't have to do very often. I think the main questions that we had tonight really were thinking about this whole idea of having an alternative to building inclusionary units on site. I think we'd like to get some feedback from you all about the different options that might be available, whether one option might seem preferable to the others. That's one kind of aspect we'd like to discuss. And I think that's probably about it. Do we want to? Okay.
May I ask you, just before we get into questions, on the alternatives, would you clarify for us what you mean by land dedication?
So, say the developer was able to either, hypothetically, they had a large enough lot that they could maybe provide land to an affordable housing developer to build an affordable housing development, or they could buy another piece of land in town and sell it at a low price to an affordable housing developer to build a affordable housing project. It's literally they'd be providing land. They wouldn't be building it, but they'd be providing land for a project to be built by someone that actually builds affordable housing.
But would that in turn require a developer signed on board to actually build something? Because you could always,
We'd have to find an affordable housing developer. I mean, typically they would partner with someone like Bridge Housing
okay.
or who else is here? Mid-Penn.
I'm just thinking it through. If you bought a horrible piece of land and a developer said, I'm not going to build there, and you couldn't find anyone, that's why I'm
The
asking.
land would have, there are certain regulations that if that was an option we wanted to go with, the land that was dedicated would have to be developable. So they couldn't just, buy a sand pit and say, okay, here's the land.
Right.
They'd have to demonstrate it actually could be developed with affordable housing.
Okay. Are you ready for more questions?
Yes.
Okay. Commissioner Sayasan.
Well, no, I mean, I think all the options, I mean, I don't see why we wouldn't look at and apply all of them as long as they're feasible. There's no reason to limit ourselves. I mean, if one turns out to not fulfill the objectives that we want, then we would, choose one that's more workable. So, I mean, would there be a reason why we would want to isolate certain ones and disregard others?
I think all these are, when you start talking about off-sites and dedications and acquisition and rehabilitation, there's a certain amount of city, I wouldn't say necessarily not planning like we do, but basically administrative infrastructure to make all those kind of things happen. And so it's not to say they can't be done, but the idea of putting them in an ordinance and saying that's an option for somebody, it really puts the burden on the city to say that, yeah, we have a program in place that someone could do that. We can't say, well, you're going to do that and we're going to have to make up a program whole cloth to allow them to implement what we're saying they can do. So, I mean, that's why you could leave it sort of, or, any of the above, but, that puts quite the burden on the city to basically be able to implement any one of those, assuming they're at the developer's discretion, not the city's direction. And that's would be of concern to me in terms of administration. So,
Okay, that's something to think about.
Do you have any other questions?
Not right now. I'm just processing things at the moment.
Okay, Commissioner Gomez?
Yeah, just continuing that thought on the options here. I think options are favorable. I think that there's, in my mind, must be other cities that have kind of left open these different categories. And so, to John's point, yeah, the concern about additional administrative burden on the city, like I fully get that concern. I'm wondering, if there's kind of, best practices or what's been done, effectively and efficiently from some other cities, probably larger, right, that have had the land, that have had some of these challenges, and, what have they done and what could we adopt potentially? My initial thoughts on this were actually, kind of grabbing like the top two, but then I think it is having a little, when you present options, I think it creates opportunity for a little bit more innovation, a little bit more creativity, but we have to have some teeth behind this so that the net gain is that there's actually more affordable housing being developed, right? That we're not just kind of in this kind of funny game, if you will, right? Where we've got properties being developed, but it's all market rate stuff. But we've got these alternatives, and we're following state law, and we have this great ordinance in here, but it's not actually, it's not providing the results that we want, and I think that's a major issue to think about. I was talking with a few folks around just rehabilitating old units, and so maybe that's like almost a deeper discussion in the realm of affordable housing. If that were to be, if there's a way to say within this, it's like, yeah, there's options. We've done a little bit of assessment, and it could be a situation where we provide, what's the word I'm looking for, where we would encourage one particular option in a way that, and I don't know if a lot of this is my thinking is, are other cities doing this in such a way that it kind of drives people to one particular option, even though they're providing more than one option, so to allow that flexibility. Obviously, this is going to require more research, I think. But other than that, yeah, I think that's all I have at this point.
Okay, thank you. Gives us a lot to think about. So I'm going to go through your list, bottom to top. Acquisition and rehabilitation of existing units. It sounds really good, and it could obviously promote more affordable housing. Here's my concern. You're displacing someone who's already living there. If you buy a building and you're going to make it inclusionary and you're setting, or unless I'm misreading, could you comment on that?
Well, again, we haven't really, sort of an option, not a program that's been
Right.
fleshed out. But the idea certainly would not be to create a displacement situation. The expectation, I think the way this has been done is you have units that are already most likely, and again, this is something you'll find in bigger cities where they have a larger stock of housing, where you have at-risk units, which means they're buildings that are already low and moderate income housing stock, but the buildings themselves are becoming dangerous or dilapidated. And so typically what those kind of programs do are renovating and rehabilitating existing low mod units to make sure they meet safety standards that they don't, just by neglect or by time or age or whatever, they're not being maintained in a sort of safe and habitable manner over time. But I mean, those would be certainly those are all kind of details, and that's, again, I understand the idea of keeping options open, but every time we keep one of these options open, we're going to have to chase down, what are those sort of parameters. And the other thing is control, right? Because acquisition and rehabilitation all relies on having a willing partner, right? So again, what is the likelihood that someone is going to be able to negotiate, even if we did have a project that we identified that, yes, this is a project that is suitable or in need of this kind of care, the city's not necessarily in a position to condemn that property to make that happen. So those are all, I think when Julia does more research, we'll do kind of two sides of this coin. One is, what other practices are best practices in both larger and maybe other cities on the peninsula that are more similar in size, so you had a better sense of what's happening. And, because there is a scalability issue when you're looking at all these programs. And then we'll probably look at some of the more unique circumstances that are, Brisbane specific to the extent we can, and forecast whether, if we think, well, this is a great option. Well, if it's a great option on paper and it works in city, C down the peninsula, whether or not the sort of situation in Brisbane is going to allow for that to be a successful program here, we'll try to give some, at least a high level sort of order of magnitude sort of opinion about what makes sense for us to.
Commissioner Gomez, you were saying, can a city guide towards a certain option even if we have many? And I think we've been discussing that, the idea of an in lieu fee. Many cities have taken the option of having an in lieu fee, but it's a pretty high in lieu fee. So, and whether it's because it's the full kind of cost of developing a unit, which especially here is
Right.
really expensive.
Right.
So it could be that there is a fee option, but it's pretty high, and it may actually pan out better financially for the developer to just build the units. So even if our main goal ends up being that we need new deed restricted affordable units, and that's the kind of main goal that we have as a community, there are a variety of ways that we could provide other options, but with an eye to we'd like units to get built. So that is something we can kind of work with. And I didn't really discuss this, but we did, the city participated a couple years ago now in a countywide study, an economic study that was focused on, it studied what they call linkage fees, which are basically development impact fees that could be applied to new commercial development or new residential development. And those studies, again, which we have for Brisbane, kind of set up, if we were to adopt a fee, what the actual cost of development is for affordable units here, and kind of sets up that background for justifying, adopting, for example, if we want to do an in lieu fee. So we have already some legwork there on the fee side. And we can talk about that more next time.
Don't we have a city in the peninsula that recently enacted development impact fee? And it was fairly controversial. I wish I could recall who it was.
A development impact fee? Do you mean, like specifically like a linkage fee?
It was within San Mateo County or Santa Clara County.
Julie can do some more research. but
Okay.
I'm aware that several cities have adopted these
Oh.
linkage fees
Okay.
as a basis to justify their inclusionary, because by state law, prior to the state law, the idea of applying inclusionary requirements did require some sort of financial justification, and I'm aware of several cities that have adopted fees.
And I just wanted to mention, rehab of existing units could be feasible if someone purchased a house, turned it into multiple units, so that would be feasible. Apartments, again, difficulty is, you rehab of units, you're displacing people, even temporarily, so. And the fees, I would just be curious how you, how you come up with those fees and apply them, on what basis, to be fair. Off-site construction, whether that would entail, if someone had a minimal amount of inclusionary units, should there be perhaps a minimum number that would trigger the possibility of off-site construction?
Yeah, those are all, really good, sort of, if you're going to consider the suite of options, it might
Right.
be that some of these options there is a scale kind of component that you're
Exact-
getting at, and you're tying it to, if you're doing, over a certain size, you have maybe more flexibility. The idea is there's more options. If it's a small sort of requirement, practically speaking, you're not going to generate enough funds to really, so maybe you need to, create a standalone project, so maybe for those smaller ones in inclusion areas, your only option, a fee rather, an in lieu fee is the only way to do that, and you can't really expect someone to do a separate project based on a small inclusionary requirement.
Right. And land dedication, the only one thing comes to mind is that we do have a limited amount of land potential in that regard. And if someone goes to an area that is not zoned, does that trigger, well, we're asking for rezoning of that area? So just some thoughts. Any other things come to mind? Go ahead.
I did have one, I know it's a little off, and I don't know if we have the data, but just a curiosity, because you brought up, displacing people. I'm curious if we have any sort of data on dwellings that are not, they're vacant. No one's living in those houses. Do we have any sort of understanding of that, and could that be somehow explored within this? Because if we've got built environment that's not being purposed, is there a way that we can actually add some more value, even though understanding there's private property and all this stuff? I'm just wondering if that's ever been thought about.
We can look into that. The last couple, typically that data comes up through housing element cycles, and I think Department of Finance probably does it more regularly than that. You'll find, at least historically, the vacancy rates in Brisbane are fairly low to what they consider. They usually have a threshold of what they consider a functional market is going to be over 5% or no less than 5% vacancy rate. You won't find, at least in experience here, is that the vacancy rate is much higher than what they consider the minimum to have a functional sort of rental market.
Okay.
But we can look into that again.
Okay.
Good idea, in that if you've got something that's just sitting, there used to
Yeah.
be more just sitting.
Yeah. I-
And if it makes it
Purely just
functional and,
thinking,
and
uh,
keeps the community,
Yeah, exactly. It could add more vibrancy if there's
Right.
built environments or for one reason or another or not.
right,
You know, take a look at it.
right.
And on the issue of the acquisition and really rehabilitation of existing units, my thinking always when I looked at that was that we wouldn't be displacing anybody. So, that we would just be looking at unoccupied units if we were going to allow them to do this. So is that actually something we would be considering as existing, like occupied units, that this would be considered?
Well, again, it's a scale issue. The way I've seen this done and implemented in larger jurisdictions, you're talking about multifamily typically. It's not usually single family is not the means. They're not the idea of kind of taking a house and then renovating it and then deed restricting it. I haven't seen that kind of program, frankly, on any single family houses. That's not too.
So you're saying that then this more or less would apply to apartment buildings?
I'm not saying-
Existing,
Yeah, I'm not saying, again, this is all ideas, right?
Right,
I'm
it's
saying
hypothetical.
The experience, my experience in other programs is it's multifamily, yes. Yes.
I just had something pop into my head, and this was from several months back when we had, I believe it was the use permit over on San Bruno for the single-family home to get torn down and put in a 3 or 4 unit. That's where my mind was going initially around, if there was acquisition and rehabilitation of existing units, is there an older home, and okay, could we be displacing someone? Perhaps. Maybe there's a transition strategy there. If the end result is more housing and we get affordable housing somewhere within that framework, I think that's something we should be looking at. Granted, that requires deeper studies, but
Yeah, I think those are all great ideas. I think what you'll find at some point, and it really is kind of a lever of what you're, as a policy objective, what you're trying to achieve, because, the same with a fee, you can create alternatives that are basically more onerous than providing inclusionary within a project, or you can swing it the other way where these other programs are seen as more economically viable for a developer. Again, we haven't researched this, but my gut tells me that buying and renovating single-family residences would probably tilt the scale toward, it's probably cheaper for somebody to just include the inclusionary in their project and be done with it. That's, we can look into that. Those are all options, but again, those are going to be sort of consequences of choices you make as a group, because you may think it's a great idea, but if, again, it doesn't pencil for somebody, they're going to take, usually the most economically expedient and efficient way to meet the requirement.
So could you speak to the city's affordable housing fund as potential recipient of in lieu fees and how that is applied in the city? Just a short version.
Well, it hasn't really been applied recently.
Yeah, well, the problem is that, again, I don't know how much all the commissioners know, and probably all know about the demise of redevelopment. And when redevelopment was active, the city had a constant stream of revenue into the low and moderate income sort of fund. When redevelopment was killed, that revenue stream was terminated. So the city has, what do we have, $1 million? Is that what we have?
Around $1 million, and we haven't spent it. And it is hard because when you look at the cost to actually subsidize the development of new housing, it's very expensive. So $1 million is a lot.
It seems like
But-
a lot of money, but in the world of affordable housing, it does not.
Drop.
Doesn't
very
go
far.
super far.
So you're
Unless-
referring to the successor agency?
That's actually the housing authority is
Ah, I see.
that's where all the low mod housing money end up with the housing authority. The city council, wearing another hat, serves as the housing authority and administers those.
As well as the successor agency. But the housing authority administers that fund. So, and I know that the council is looking at different options to, different affordable housing kind of programs that might be, smaller in nature. And, we have our first time home buyer loan program that was active for about 5 years. Hasn't been active for the past 7 years, but that's certainly something that is, money that in the form of a silent second mortgage that helps people buy their first home. That's an affordable price for them. So there are other programs that involve kind of smaller outlays of cash that can also achieve, getting actual affordable housing into the hands of people that need it, other than just building deed restricted units. So that's kind of the dilemma of having in lieu fees is we can collect the fees, but like how long do we really, how long are we going to have to wait until we have enough kind of critical mass of fees to then say, okay, great, now we can actually subsidize a 10 unit project or a 5 unit project or whatever it may be. So there's a lot of kind of philosophical discussion about like, an in lieu fee is great, but like how are we actually going to use it to achieve our affordable housing goals? Especially when as a city, we see smaller projects and we've seen more small projects coming in, 3 and 4 unit developments. And those don't rise to the threshold we have. We have 6 unit minimum to even apply to get one affordable housing unit. So when you think about the kinds of projects we're going to be seeing, how many projects really are even going to be subject to that, and then potentially would be paying an in lieu fee.
Right.
So-
So that was kind of my. I just didn't say it. That was kind of my point. Is that are we just seeing all these kind of 3 and 4 units to kind of
Right.
bypass all of this and quote unquote the economics work for those projects in various scenarios, whether it's a complete tear down, right, or rezoning or whatever's the particular circumstances. I'm just within that context, I'm just trying to think, okay, is that the path we're going to continue going down, or is there a way that we can somehow be creative to where it provides a stimulus to be able to do these actual larger projects that then provide that benefit of affordable housing?
Again, the whole housing funding issue is going to be bigger than this too, because you're seeing kind of a piece of when it can be imposed. This idea of in lieu fees for inclusionary requirements. There are other cities on the peninsula that charge a low mod housing fee on all market rate housing, because that's part of these nexus studies. They will demonstrate that even market rate housing and creates a demand for service jobs and for lower income sort of housing opportunities. So that's something that's kind of another piece of the housing puzzle. It's more of a council policy issue. It's not something that would be embedded into the zoning ordinance per se. But I mean, there are those kind of things, commercial linkage fees, which Julia mentioned. You can charge that on new commercial buildings that, again, they generate workers and that have a housing demand and service workers. And so there are other, if the council wants to be aggressive in sort of fee collection, this is not going to be the only kind of revenue source, certainly, for housing fees. If they would go that route, they don't have to go that route.
Good point. Thank you. Commissioner Saison, anything else?
No, I think, well, this is kind of our first round at this, so I think, we'll have more questions, and as, you guys explore it further, I think, we can continue to perhaps, trim down the options here, so.
So I think what maybe we can do next time is bring back real world examples of cities, hopefully, our neighbor cities, who have adopted options, like the ones we're looking at here. So you can kind of see how real life examples would be. The other question that I kind of glossed over, but I would actually like us to talk about. So I mentioned that under the new state law, if we wanted to have an inclusionary requirement for rental that's over 15%, we would need to have this economic justification study, which I'm guessing it's would be a fairly expensive endeavor, and the burden would kind of be on us, right, to really prove that we're not being prohibitive towards new development. So assuming that we kind of feel like doing the 15% flat percentage is the best way for a rental, we aren't required to do the same kind of economic study for sale housing developments. But I'm curious if you see any merit to kind of normalizing across the board our inclusionary requirement, regardless of whether it's for sale or rental, or if you see any merit in keeping, potentially a slightly higher, depending on those ranges, up to 20% inclusionary requirement for sale projects. Do you guys have any sort of qualms about having different requirements, essentially, whether it's rental or for sale? And I understand I'm just throwing this at you guys now. So
I think we keep it equal. I mean, I don't see any reason to have one standard for one and another for the other. Yeah, so
I think one criteria, if you are able to come back to us with other cities, preferably Santa Clara, San Mateo County, Marin, Alameda, Contra Costa, small cities that have inclusionary zoning and requirements, so that we can see on a practical basis how is a small city operating with this. Because I think Redwood City and San Mateo have these requirements, but they're so much larger. They have more land area. They have larger population. And their scale of building is very different than what we have here. We're just challenged in a different way. So on the surface, I would agree with Commissioner Sias on rental versus for sale, but perhaps there might be a reason. We'll see.
Mm-hmm.
Commissioner Gomez?
Yeah, I was thinking the same thoughts. So I think that whatever other smaller cities are doing, I think that following that, practice is probably in our best interest.
And perhaps if it's hard to find small cities, the place to look for those as well would be Marin County, where it's very pricey, but there's a lot of small cities up there. And they may have already grappled with this challenge. I don't know. Anything else? No? Thank you, Julia. So we'll move on then to Ken's presentation, off-street parking ordinance review.
Thank you. On August 8th, the Planning Commission adopted a resolution indicating its intent to initiate an amendment to the off-street parking ordinance. That ordinance, Chapter 1734 of the Municipal Code. And tonight's workshop is just an introductory one. It's intended to frame up the primary areas of interest that will be addressed in the amendment, and to provide the Planning Commission with an opportunity to give preliminary feedback on these areas of interest. As indicated in the Planning Commission's resolution in August, the update would primarily address the non-residential parking standards, but it would also be to comprehensively update the structure and organization of the ordinance for clarity. Staff anticipates that this might be the first of a few or possibly even several workshops with the Commission on this matter prior to the Commission holding a public hearing on the revised draft. So this slide, and it's essentially mirrors what you saw in the agenda report. It provides an outline of those primary areas of interest. First is the reorganization. The current ordinance provides the parking standards and design requirements in a mixed format. And so for clarity, the ordinance would be reorganized around the residential and non-residential provisions separately. With regards to the tables, and there's a a parking lot or parking garage illustration. The tables would be reorganized for clarity, and that illustration is quite difficult to read. If you see it in the handout that you have at the back of the memo, so that would be redrawn just for legibility. On the third item, the cross-references where other state and local codes are related but preempt the parking ordinance, cross-references would be added and duplicative text would be eliminated from the ordinance. And that also helps if there are updates to those other ordinance. It doesn't leave the parking ordinance essentially in a state of non-compliance, if you will. So on the fourth item, on the non-residential standards, the focus of the parking ordinance would be to update those. And most recently, the council adopted residential standards, but left the non-residential essentially untouched. So the focus would be on those especially, and to reconcile the gaps that exist between the permitted and conditional uses allowed in the various zoning districts and the parking standards provided in the parking ordinance. And one example of that was earlier this year, you had a use permit for R&D out on Sierra Point where we didn't have an R&D standard. So that would be one item that we would look at. And then finally, parking use versus exception. Currently, the zoning ordinance refers to the proposed site-specific modifications to the parking standards as requiring a use permit. And use permits are primarily intended to address land use related issues and are not necessarily directly relevant to altering a development standard such as parking. As such, they have a set of findings that are not directly related or not as closely tied as we might like to the parking. And so requests for parking modifications may more accurately be addressed as exceptions subject to specific findings that are directly relevant to the parking related issues. So the amendment would establish application procedures and findings for exceptions versus having a use permit that refers to the use permit chapter. So as I mentioned, tonight's workshop is really just to introduce the areas of interest, not necessarily get into the weeds too much, but if you have any thoughts on these areas or have overall nagging concerns that you want to make sure that we address, be happy to hear those or answer any questions you might have.
Thank you, Ken. Commissioner Gomez, you want to start?
I don't have any comments at this particular point.
Commissioner Sysa?
Yeah, same for me. I think this is something that just needs to be fleshed out more, and probably, we'd want public input before we, make things more concrete. So I think this is a good start to get us thinking, and then, maybe later on we can fine-tune things a bit more.
And I just comment that Crocker is close to capacity, I'm told, in terms of
Occupancy.
occupancy, yes. And Sierra Point obviously is still a work in progress, but a lot of changes going on there.
Right.
So I think both of those will be part of this discussion.
Right. This ordinance would touch the parking applies citywide to all zoning districts. So as you see in the tables of the ordinance, it essentially ties it to a use, and so if the use is allowed in a particular district, then that's how it would be addressed on a district basis.
So just one clarification, someplace like visitation, which is residential and commercial. Could you address that? Is that problematic when it comes to determining whether it falls under residential or commercial standards?
Right, so visitation's a little tricky in that you know, it's essentially built out. You have generally very small lots, and backing up a little bit, so the commercial side is essentially, if it's ground floor or storefront use, it's exempt from the parking. Essentially, the parking, the on-street parking is recognized as meeting the requirement. Second floor office type space would not have that same exemption, and residential would not have that same exemption. So the difficulty is getting, I guess, seeing sites upgrade. You know, we have a number of sites that there's been interest in that are very small, and trying to shoehorn parking into those lots becomes problematic. So that might be something that the commission wants to explore further.
And one other idea comes to mind where we have Parkside with a zoning overlay. Right now, it's commercial. But should the property owners wish to convert it, would the parking automatically change, or how would that work?
The Parkside plan and the overlay zoning we adopted has parking requirements in it. So
Okay.
that wouldn't change. So the overlay zone has its own parking requirements. And I assume we would reference them.
Right.
Yeah. In fact, I believe we
Okay, that's interesting. Thank you. Anyone else? Questions come to mind? No, I think we'll probably see a lot more questions come when we have the next workshop on this.
Right, as we get into the meat of it, I'm
Right.
sure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Anything else from staff regarding these two workshops, since we've moved from one to the other, that come to mind that you'd like to underscore these two?
No, and maybe, maybe Ken and Julia, you might want to talk about next steps here, so the commission is sort of teed up in terms of what to expect. So maybe I turn it over to Julia first to talk through that.
Sure. So, as I said, I think we'll have one more workshop for this. For the density bonus section, I think it's a bit more clear cut what we need to do to update that part of our ordinance. So we might kind of move forward with draft language there. But the inclusionary housing portion of it, I think we heard from you tonight that you want to see some more examples of how other cities have implemented their own regulations. So I think we'll come back with more items for discussion, more specific items for discussion next time for inclusionary. But the density bonus, I think we might just kind of move forward to draft language.
That makes sense. Thank you very much. Ken?
Right, so for mine, I'll be breaking this out into organizational structure will be, I think, a good focus for an evening. We may include in that same, or we may break it out. I'll have to see how this looks in terms of how much time it might take to get through each, but maybe include as well in that the exceptions versus use permit, and then break out as well the specific standards for non-residential parking, and that in itself will be a pretty lengthy discussion, and so I'll break it out into pieces like that, and we'll put it all together.
Okay, thank you very much. All right, then we move on to items initiated by staff.
I'm going to have to kind of beg the commission's indulgence. The
You have it.
November 8th meeting date is, may be squeezed by some other alternative needs by the city council. And if that's the case, we would need to reschedule our November 8th, regularly scheduled November 8th meeting. I think were we thinking about the 15th?
Yeah, November 15th. Which, remember, we also have a special meeting at the end of the month because we've canceled our November 22nd meeting. So our last meeting in November is November 29th. So if we met on the 15th, that would still give 2 weeks in between.
Yeah,
And
have
we'll check with.
two
the-
commissioners not here, and I may potentially have a conflict on that. I'll have to check. Okay,
All right, well, thank you for considering that.
all right, thank you. Any items initiated by the commission? Oh, seeing none, okay. We'll entertain a motion for adjournment. Our next meeting will be October 25th. That's Thursday at 7:30. A motion, please? Let's
Go ahead.
race.
I move that we adjourn till the next meeting.
I second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Thank you very much. Good night.